Boker Tov, welcome in to Mishkan Katan. It's a pleasure to be with you once again. It's Rosh Chodesh. We've begun a new biblical calendar month as of last evening. So it's a wonderful time of year, always, the first day of the month. We have been studying here at Mishkan Katan a chronological overview a chronological overview of the Bible. And we started with Genesis. Last teaching session, which aired last Wednesday, we got all the way up through Lot, the nephew of Abraham. And Lot had two daughters. His two daughters fled with him from the destroyed cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. They went to live briefly in the mountains nearby, and his two daughters became the mothers of two great nations who became enemies of Israel for the most part. One of them was the mother of the Ammonites, and one was the mother of the Moabites. Now, moving on in our chronology, our next signpost is just ahead. Isaac was one of the sons of Abraham. He was called the son of promise because it was through Isaac that the messianic line was going to continue. Isaac had twin sons with his wife Rebekah, who was the daughter of Laban, or Laban as he's called in English. Laban was the brother of Isaac's mother, Rebekah. Of Isaac's mother. Isaac's mother was Sarah. So wait a minute. I'm getting this all confused. This is what happens when I freelance. Okay. All right. Wait a minute. Laban was Rebekah's mother. Rebekah was married to Isaac. Okay. So Isaac and Rebekah had two sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob went on to go back to his home. He eventually married two wives from his home country, the daughters of Laban. Okay, I got that straight. Whew. All right. So your next signpost is 1793 BCE. These were the twin sons of Isaac and Rebekah. That's when they were born. And Jacob, who was the son of promise, through which the messianic line would continue. Jacob was the patriarch of the 12 tribes of the Hebrews. And his brother Esau was the father of the Edomites. The Edomites settled in the hilly desert area called Edom. Now, we move on to the book of Exodus next. Jacob and his 12 sons, it was a total of 70 people. That entire family went to live in Egypt, and they did that in the area called Giza or Goshen. They lived there for 210 years. The reason that they went there is because there was a terrible famine in the land of Canaan. And things started out well, and they continued so while Joseph, Jacob's most favored son, was alive. Joseph, however, was not chosen by God to be the ancestor of Yeshua, of Jesus. He was a redeemer type. He was a type of the redemptive nature of Yeshua because Joseph was the son of Jacob, which ended up saving the entire family of Jacob through the famine. Now, the next big challenge that the Hebrew people faced was the Egyptian enslavement, which began after the death of Joseph in 1591 BCE. There's your next signpost, 1591 BCE. And this period ended in 1447 BCE. This period of enslavement lasted about 144 years. The Hebrews were enslaved for over half of the years that they were in Egypt. And Moshe, was born during these years of enslavement. Here's your next signpost. Moshe was born in 1527 BCE. Now, Moses survived an evil Pharaoh who foreshadowed King Herod in the New Testament. And that's another rabbit trail we're not going to go down. But just very briefly, the king that was in power in Egypt when Moshe was born ordered the killing of the Hebrew sons. That's why Moses ended up in a basket in the bulrushes of the Nile River, recall? And then King Herod in New Testament days, when the wise men, the Magi, the Babylonian Jews, wise men, visited King Herod, and he was threatened. He felt his power was threatened. He ordered the execution of all male babies under 2 years old in his kingdom. So that's why this Pharaoh was a type of King Herod. All right, let me get back on track here. So Moses was 80 when he began his ministry, so to speak, and he lived for about 40 more years. Moses should give all of us who started careers late in life great hope, right? For about 40 years, he lived in Egypt, and then for the next 40 years, he served his father-in-law, Jethro of Midian, and then for the last 40 years, he served as the deliverer of the Hebrew nation from slavery. The Exodus, one of the most key dates in all of Scripture, here you go, if you're writing these down, took place on March 22nd and 23rd, 1447 BCE. Now, when most Christians think of this event called the Exodus, they don't usually believe it really applies to them. However, here are two key points which show that to be untrue. The first one. The Jewish sages say that most of the Hebrew people did not leave Egypt in the Exodus. That's going to come as a surprise to some people. Some from each of the 12 tribes left, for sure. However, a sizable percentage did not leave. I was discussing this with an Orthodox rabbi recently and postulated that the reason they did not leave, a lot of them, was because they could not conceive of themselves as being anything other than slaves. The slave mentality was present even in those who did leave. We see it in their laments in the desert, complaining to Moses as to why he didn't just let them die in Egypt, as that would have been preferable to them. And it was also present then in those who actually stayed in Egypt. Number two, the group that left contained a sizable number of Egyptians, along with the Hebrews, the children of Jacob. The Bible describes this as a mixed multitude. Those who trusted in Father Yahweh by obeying his commands and who left along with the Hebrews had to learn the ways of God by obeying his commands, just as the Hebrew people had to relearn them. The Torah was given at Mount Sinai to a redeemed, mixed multitude. First, Father Yahweh redeemed them from slavery in Egypt and from certain death at the Sea of Reeds, what many call the Red Sea. And only then, after he redeemed them, did he give them his instruction, the written Torah at Mount Sinai through Moses. 1/3 of the Old Testament took place during the 40 years of wilderness wanderings. So it was a very important series of events, this Exodus and the 40 years in the desert. That's why people who believe in Yeshua as their Mashiach, as their Messiah, should really consider the Exodus as having, as applying to them. And they should view it as the fact that in spirit, they were actually there. They are our spiritual ancestors, our spiritual forerunners. And so had they not been redeemed from Egypt and through the Red Sea, neither would we be. All right, during the time of Moses, when the people were at Mount Sinai, when the 10 Commandments were given by God, the first Sanhedrin was formed at the suggestion, divinely inspired, of Moses's father-in-law, Jethro, who is called a priest of Midian. Now, no one's really completely sure what that means, whether he followed Father Yahweh or not, but this is mentioned in Exodus 18, verses 13 through 27. And at that time, at Jethro's suggestion, his Hebrew name is pronounced Yitro, 70 godly leaders were selected, and Moses was the leader of the group, making it 71. And the scriptures say that God took some of his spirit, his spirit, Father Yahweh's spirit, that he had placed on Moses, and he transferred it to these 70 men. This is one such appearance of the Holy Spirit in the Tanakh. The Holy Spirit of God was not first seen at the Christian festival called Pentecost. The Spirit of God was present to empower all the heroes of the Tanakh to carry out the will of God. So there, during the 40 years of wilderness wandering, Moses wrote down the first books of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Bible, and we call those 5 books the Torah, although the term Torah, as I mentioned, means instruction, and it can pertain to all the instruction from God. And Moses also took that oral tradition that had been passed down through the generations since Adam, and under the direction of the Holy Spirit, Moses wrote all that history down, plus the 613 commandments he received from God himself during those years in the desert. And it's also believed that Moses recorded the story of Job, a righteous man who lived sometime before Moses' day. Now we're moving on to the books of Leviticus and Numbers. And my goal, let me just say, my goal is to get all the way to the end of the Tanakh, all the way to the end of the Old Testament today. So if in my head, I hear the William Tell overture playing, that. So I don't know if we'll get there or not, but that's the goal. So we'll see. All right. The books of Leviticus and Numbers were written by Moses, as I just said, and they detail the instructions that Father Yahweh gave to him concerning how the people of God were to live before God and how to draw near to Father Yahweh himself. The book of Deuteronomy recaps a lot of the history, and it gives Moses' last words to the Hebrew people, to Israel. The entire 5th book of the Bible was written on the day of Moses' death, which was, here's your next signpost, January 6th, 1406 BCE. Well, it's believed that Joshua wrote the very last part of Deuteronomy, as a dead man can't write anything. And the death of Moses was recorded at the end of the book of Deuteronomy. So, how many generations were there from Abraham to King David? There were 14. All right, so we're motoring on toward King David here. Our journey on this glory road, remember the name of this series is Signposts on the Glory Road. We next go to the book of Joshua, or Yehoshua, as it is pronounced in the actual Hebrew. Now, Joshua became Moses' right-hand man at the tender young age of 19. This occurred right after the Exodus, and he also succeeded Moses to lead the Hebrew people into the promised land around 1405 BCE. It was at that time when he led the successful battle of Jericho. He was 60 years old at the time. After this decisive victory at Jericho, he oversaw the assigning of each tribe a parcel of land. And this took place over the period of 40 years of Joshua's leadership. And one thing I learned recently in reading the Parsha, reading a recent Parsha, is that the parcels of land, if you look at a map of ancient Israel, when the parcels were parceled out, you might say. Some of them are much larger than others. And this was done according to the size of the tribe. There was a counting of the numbers of men of a certain age in each tribe shortly before the land was parceled out. And so it was according to the numbers of people in each tribe that determined the size of that tribe's parcel. I thought that was interesting. All right. Now, most of the pagan people were conquered during the years of Joshua's leadership. However, not all of them were conquered, and this was due to the Hebrew people's own lapses into paganism. And sadly, they lost no time after the death of Joshua in leaping back into paganism. Now, before you tut about the Hebrew people, it's important to try and understand the context of the day. Maybe some of you have children who have wandered off the path of righteousness. Maybe they've even forsaken the faith of their fathers and they've leaped off into utter paganism. And maybe your heart grieves about that. And maybe you say, oh, that happened because they were raised up in the ways of Father Yahweh, but now they have chosen to live their lives according to the pagan ways of the people which surround them. Okay, that's very likely what influenced their choice. However, I want you to understand that the Hebrew people, all the peoples of the world in their day, were mired deeply in paganism. Only the Hebrews possessed God's truth, and they were commanded to be a light unto the nations. I don't think we can conceive of how difficult that was. So, yes, the Hebrews frequently wandered off the path. However, they had a huge hill or mountain to overcome. They were called to exist in a very unfriendly spiritual environment of utter paganism. And I believe this was part of the will of Father Yahweh in order to manifest his great glory through them. Now, we will move on to the book of Judges. After Joshua died, the next generation of Israelites, as I said, forgot their God. And you can read about this apostasy in the last chapter of the book of Joshua, that's chapter 24, and the first two chapters of the book of Judges. Caleb's daughter, you may remember Caleb as being one of the 12 spies who was righteous. There were only 2 righteous spies of the 12, and that was Caleb and who else? Joshua, right? So Caleb's daughter had been given in marriage to a mighty and ambitious man named Othniel. Othniel was the first of the judges in a long line of judges who ruled over Israel from 1356 BCE to around 975 BCE. That's about 380 years. I know that you all don't sit there with your pens poised, so let me give you those dates again. 1356 BCE to 975 BCE. It's a period of about 380 years. Now note that the period of the judges continues on into 1 Samuel. During this very chaotic period, some of the judges were good, such as Deborah and Gideon, to start with, to name 2, and many of them were evil. As a result, the people began again abandoning God's divine commandments. Toward the end of this period, even the priesthood became morally corrupted, as evidenced by the sins of Eli's sons. Now, this was the time also of barren Hannah, that godly woman who so badly wanted to have a child, and who eventually received her firstborn son, Samuel, who grew up to become the last and one of the greatest judges. Despite overwhelming apostasy, a righteous remnant of the priesthood was preserved by the Almighty, El Shaddai. And these priests had an altar and a shrine and the Ark of the Covenant at Shiloh, or Shiloh, as English people generally pronounce it. Now, as far as establishing a biblical chronology, Joshua and Judges are very difficult books. They're both rather topsy-turvy. Counting in linear time exactly as the books are laid out is not the way to go. A couple of examples without getting too much into the weeds here. First of all, some of the events laid out in Joshua also occur in the early chapters of Judges, as I mentioned a moment ago. The two books overlap slightly. You can look at Joshua 15, 16 through 17, and compare that with Judges 1, 12 through 13. Secondly, a well-known judge named Samson, a very colorful judge, ruled for 20 years near the end of the Judges period, even though his story occurs near the beginning of that book, probably due to the sensationalism of and the importance of his judgeship. The story of Ruth and Boaz occurred sometime during the period of the Judges. Boaz's great-granddad was leading the tribe of Judah at the beginning of the Sinai years. His name was Nahshon, and you can compare Numbers chapter 2, verse 3 with Ruth chapter 4, verses 20 through 22, and you will see Nahshon in the genealogical lineup there in Ruth 4. Jewish sages say that Boaz was 80 years old when the story of Ruth took place. Ruth and Boaz's son was Obed, and his son was Jesse, and Jesse was the father of David HaMelech, David the king. And David, here's another signpost for you, was born around 1056 BCE, near the start of the rule of Saul, who began to rule, another signpost, in 1051 BCE. Now Samuel, the last of the judges, oversaw the anointing and the rule of Israel's first king, whose name was Saul. God had warned the people through Samuel that getting a king, like the pagan peoples around them, would be a bad move for the Hebrew people. As always, history proved that God certainly knew what he was talking about, despite the fact that Samuel essentially co-ruled with Saul for the first 15 years of his reign and tried to rein him in. Sorry, another one of my bad puns. Overall, despite the influence of Samuel, Saul was not a great king during his 40-year reign of 1051 BCE to 1011 BCE. He was a son of Kish, a Benjaminite. I think I said that right. This is a very important fact to know. Saul was the only king of the Hebrew people and later of Judah who was not of the tribe of Judah. David, who was of the tribe of Judah, married Saul's daughter and was dear friends with one of Saul's sons, whose name was Jonathan. David went on to become Israel's greatest king in the year 1011 BCE. He was a prototype of the Messiah. He reigned for 40 years and 6 months and died in the year 971. King David wrote about half of the book of Psalms. Now, during his reign, at the beginning of his reign, particularly, Jerusalem was not the center of things. It was not the ruling city. And David did not begin his rule there. He actually began it in Shiloh, I believe, but I know that he ruled in Shiloh before he came to Jerusalem. I can safely say that. But it was David who established Jerusalem as the capital of the land. And once he did, he moved the ark there from Shiloh and was given by God the blueprints, the tavnit, as it's called in Hebrew, for the first permanent structure for the house of God, the temple. The Lord made another important covenant around this time, this one with King David. Essentially, he promised David that his descendants from the tribe of Judah would reign forever. In this covenant, recorded in 2 Samuel 7 and in 1 Chronicles 17, 11 through 14, and also in 2 Chronicles 6, 16, Father Yahweh made an unconditional covenant, which reaffirmed the covenants he had made with Abraham and Moses and Adam. Well and good. But look what happened after this. Other than Nathan and King Solomon, who succeeded David in 971 BCE after several bloody coups by their brothers, King David's sons were unmitigated disasters. It was Solomon, son of Bathsheba, who reigned for 14 years and began to build the first temple in his fourth year, which was 967 BCE, fulfilling God's word that one of David's sons would be the builder of the temple. Solomon was a man of the written word, as was his father. He wrote the book of Proverbs, Song of Solomon, and Ecclesiastes. And despite his immense wisdom in other areas, Solomon had a severe problem. It was his libido, and this wreaked a great amount of havoc in his kingdom and in the years following. Note that Mary, the mother of the Messiah, Yeshua, Mary's ancestor from the tribe of Judah, was one of David's other sons, one of the more godly ones, a quiet figure whom I just mentioned, named Nathan. In the generation following Solomon, 956 BCE and following, God allowed an absolute tyrant, Solomon's son Rehoboam, to become the king of the Jewish people in 931 BCE. Because Rehoboam treated the people so badly, the family tribal territories of the 10 most northern tribes more or less seceded from the Union. It was essentially a familial civil war. They broke off, established their own seat of government, Samaria, crowned their own king, Jeroboam, established their own temple and places of worship, altars, and so forth. Now, what is wrong with that, you might say? Well, because Father Yahweh had ordained that there would be one temple and it would be in Jerusalem, that there would be one set of priests and that they would be Levitical, and so on and so forth. Thankfully, the Levitical priests did not go along with this ungodly plan, and so they did not take part in all of that false worship there in Samaria. And in effect, these 10 tribes, they left God's plan for his people in a drastic way. Remaining in Judah were the tribes of Judah and Levi, the priestly tribe, and Benjamin. Now, the books of Jonah, Hosea, Amos, Isaiah, Micah, Nahum, and Zephaniah were written during this period after the split. This period of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom going along in their parallel paths. I know you must be thinking, well, this certainly seems to have gone to hell in a handbasket. What about the Davidic covenant? Essentially, God's promise was that Messiah Jesus would come from David's ancestral line, from his descendants. The prophecy and promise did not say that there would be an unbroken reign of David's descendants sitting on an actual earthly throne until the coming of the Messiah. I felt the need to clarify that before moving on because, believe it or not, things are about to go from bad to worse. God's promises are sure. Pardon me. You know, it's pollen season. God's promises are sure and they are eternal. But often we humans, with our limited scope, bound by time, make the mistake of believing that God will fulfill his promises on our timeline. And very often we get fooled, don't we? As the two now separate kingdoms called Israel and Judah continued on their way, the succeeding kings were sometimes awesome and more often awful. There were some attempts to reunite the two kingdoms. King Jehoshaphat, for example, who was by and large a righteous king, sought to do that through marriage to one of King Ahab of Israel's daughters, but it was an unsuccessful attempt to reunite. Like two rebellious sons, each kingdom seemed determined to outdo his brother in rebellion against Father Yahweh. Now, Elijah and Elisha, two great prophets, though they wrote no books of the Bible with their name on them, were key prophets during the period of the kings. The books of 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, and 2 Chronicles give details about the rules of the Hebrew kings. These 4 books do not follow each other chronologically, although they are listed that way in Bibles. There's a good bit of overlap between these 4 books in that they often record the same events listed elsewhere. Incidentally, the prophet Elijah was a second man who did not apparently die an earthly death. He and Enoch, if you recall from last week's teaching, Enoch the son of Seth, he and Enoch were in a very exclusive club, as both were taken up to heaven by God without seeing death. The period of the Hebrew kings is another chronology nightmare. Whoa! As Ben mentioned in the last teaching session, the chroniclers of Israel counted the reigns of their kings differently than did the chroniclers of the kingdom of Judah. There have been some attempts to try to harmonize historically the reigns of these kings, and the best chronology we have was worked out by 2 studious theologians and historians named Edwin R. Thiel. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. TBH, to be honest, I did not look it up. All right. Edwin R. Thiel and his successor, the guy who took up his mantle, Leslie McFall. The Thiel-McFall system is the system that biblical historians go by today in order to date the reigns of the Judean and the Israel kings. Again, another severe diversion beckons, but we will resist it. I'm not gonna give you the years of all those Hebrew kings. There's not enough time. All right. That's another study for another day. Eventually, The northern kingdom, called Israel, wandered so far off the theological path into abject paganism, despite the warnings of several prophets of God, such as Amos and Jonah, who served and wrote during this period, that God gave them up to their paganism and allowed them to be conquered by the Assyrians in 722 BCE. When this happened, the 10 northern tribes were scattered all across that part of the world as the Assyrians, who had a huge empire which lasted 1,500 years, took many of them away into captivity. They took them north and east and west, and some people even believe that they eventually migrated into North America, because we have found ancient Hebrew stone engravings in Hebrew well before the Europeans settled this country. At any rate, some of the Jewish people intermarried with the Assyrians, and they stayed in the land. They weren't taken away. And this is where the Samaritans of Jesus's time came from. Well, it was just a mess. The prophets Habakkuk, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel were writing during this latter part of the king's period. And the book Lamentations was written by the prophet Jeremiah during this period. Now, the kingdom of Judah, lest you think they were paragons of virtue, was not a lot better, at least initially. The Assyrians tried to conquer them too, but God stopped them because it was not that wasn't the timing of his perfect plan at that time. In a sense, he gave them a reprieve. He gave them another chance to turn things around. And during the reign of King Hezekiah, it looked like that might happen, but it didn't. About 200 years later, Judah had become so spiritually corrupted that God allowed them to be besieged by the Babylonian ruler Nebuchadnezzar around, here's another signpost for you, around 600 BCE. He hauled the Judeans off to Babylon in 3 waves for a Babylonian captivity, which lasted 70 years, which was the exact number of years Jeremiah had prophesied that the captivity would last. During this overtaking of Judea by Nebuchadnezzar, the Temple of Solomon was burned and destroyed. This took place in 586 BCE on July 11th, which was on the biblical calendar the 9th day of the month of Av, which is a day of fasting for observant Jews and Messianic Jews, Messianics to this day. It was a day of great sorrow. So there were how many generations between David and the Babylonian exile? 14. The people returned from Babylon in 3 waves, just as they had left. Not all of them returned by any stretch. Many decided that they liked life in Babylon, and they stayed. Remember the 3 magi from the Orient? They were Babylonian Jews. We will study them more deeply in the next section. Jerusalem and Babylon were the 2 biggest centers of Judaism in that part of the world for several hundred years. Egypt also began to have a growing population because, excuse me, in the conquering of Judah by the Babylonians, at the end of that time, a large group of Jerusalemites left Jerusalem and went to live in Egypt. The prophet Jeremiah was an old man by that time, and sadly, he was taken as a captive to Egypt and died there. The Babylonian Empire lasted until it was conquered by Darius and Cyrus and the rest of the Persians. During the rule of the Persian Empire, which was the largest empire in that part of the world to date, because it stretched all the way from Egypt to India, the story of Esther took place. And afterward, the book of Esther was written down. Many believe it was written down by Mordecai and Esther themselves. The prophets Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi also wrote their books during this era, the Persian era. Now, although the minor prophets are called minor, these 12 books were only called minor because they were short in length. Fun fact, the shortest book in length in the Tanakh is Obadiah. Concerning the remnant that returned from Babylon to Jerusalem during the time of the Persians, the Jews, the Judeans, rebuilt the city under the direction of Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, let me say something linguistically about this period. When the Jews were taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar, they moved from speaking Hebrew to speaking Aramaic. Aramaic was the language of both the Assyrians and the Babylonians, who both came largely from northeast of the Promised Land. So when the Jews were taken captive, the Judeans were taken captive by the Babylonians. During that 70-year period of time, they learned to speak Aramaic. And when they came back, Aramaic was I think it's sometimes called the common language. It was the commonly spoken language of the Jews. Hebrew was still spoken in synagogues. The Hebrew Bible was written in Hebrew. Jewish young boys still learned to read Hebrew, but the conversational language was Aramaic. And many Christians have never even heard of Aramaic, and that's why I mention this. Jesus spoke Aramaic because that was the language that was spoken as he was born and grew up in first century Judea. All right, let me get back on track here. The temple that Solomon had built was rebuilt during the time of the return from Babylon under the auspices of Ezra and Nehemiah. The people who during that 70 years, many of them had wandered far from the mitzvot, from the commandments of Father Yahweh and his holy festivals, began once again to follow Torah and to celebrate his holy feasts. The Sanhedrin, the great council, remember the 70 men who were ordained, you might say, at Sinai, their descendants began to function again as a ruling body of the Jewish people. And the priesthood was reinstated. And the books of Ezra and Nehemiah were written. Now, the prophet Daniel was, I believe he was the greatest prophet of the Old Testament. He lived a very long time. He was a young teenager when he was taken away as a captive to Babylon. And he was still alive at the beginning of the Persian Empire. Do you remember the story where the hand of Father Yahweh wrote on the wall during that banquet and awful orgy by Belshazzar? Remember who was called in to interpret those words written on the wall? It was none other than a very old prophet by the name of Daniel. It was during his latter years that Daniel was given the visions concerning the end of the earth age, such as Daniel 11, which I hope we will have time to get to, but I'm beginning to have my doubts that we'll get to that today. The book of Daniel and the New Testament book of Revelation are companion books, and perhaps we will revisit them in a future teaching. But after the prophet Malachi, there was a period of 400 years where the people of Judah had no prophet and no word from God. They were led and governed by the Sanhedrin during this period and up and through the time of Yeshua, Jesus, until and a little while after the destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem as a whole in 70 CE. During this period, the Sanhedrin devised much material concerning how the Jewish people should live out the 613 commandments given to them by Father Yahweh at Sinai. Although their opinions were not formally written down in written form until the 2nd century CE, they were passed along orally. The Sanhedrin was not perfect. Later, we will study this body, this governing body, more deeply as we study the earthly life of Messiah Yeshua. The 4 Gospels do not give us a lot of complete information about the religious rulers of Jesus's day because the writers had no idea their accounts would endure for 2,000 years, and they assumed their Jewish readers would understand a lot of the backstory and culture, which today in this modern era, even in Christianity, we have lost and or disregarded. Also during this period, around 300 BCE, the Greeks were ruling the land of Judah and Israel. The Jews of necessity began to learn to speak Greek, as this was the language of the civil government. Accordingly, the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, was translated into Greek by the best 70 to 72 Hebrew scholars available in that day. These, again, we emphasize, these were Hebrew scholars who could speak fluent Greek, okay? Now, this represented the first significant effort to translate a major religious text from one language to another. The New Testament authors felt comfortable using it, quoting from it in their writings, the Septuagint. It was the most commonly used translation of the Hebrew text in Jesus's day, too. Although the common language of Jesus and his Jewish contemporaries was, as I mentioned, Aramaic. Today, we know this translation of the Old Testament into Greek as the Septuagint. So I firmly believe that Yeshua spoke Aramaic, could speak and read Hebrew, and could speak Greek. Matthew 1:17 tells us this. In all, then, there were 14 generations from Abraham to David. 14 generations from David to the exile to Babylon, and 14 generations from the exile to the time of the Messiah. Matthew 1:17. Matthew points this out in his book. And we're almost finished with our study of the signposts on the glory road for the Tanakh, the Old Testament. We've passed over many instructive stories, very compelling stories along the way, stories which teach many valuable lessons about drawing near to God and his redemptive plan for mankind. There are also many Tanakh prophecies of the coming Messiah. These prophecies fall into 2 categories. The first category is that of the suffering servant, also known as Messiah ben Yosef, Messiah, son of Joseph. It was these prophecies that Yeshua fulfilled with his first coming to earth as a baby and throughout his 33-year life. The second category is the conquering king, the Messiah as the conquering king, also known as Messiah ben David, Messiah, son of David. It is these prophecies he will fulfill when he returns at the end of this current earth age. All of these prophecies are extremely important, in part because they validate the truth of Scripture, the reliability of this holy, supernatural book. They are also important because they illustrate how Father Yahweh can be trusted. These prophecies align with the religious festivals that are prescribed for followers of God in the first 5 books of Moses. Likewise, these festivals are important to study. However, again, the purpose of this teaching series is to establish biblical chronology. A comprehensive study of the biblical festivals is another study for another day. But before we part ways today, I do want to mention to you a historical event from the period between the books of Malachi and Matthew. And the reason I'm bringing this up is twofold, and I want you to listen carefully because this is very important. Number one, although the historical books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees are not part of the biblical canon of either Jews or Protestants, knowledge of the events, particularly of 1st Maccabees, is important to biblical chronology because the prophet Daniel foretold these events in Daniel chapter 11. I don't have time this morning to get into a deep study of this, although it would make a fascinating one. But one of my teachers, has documented anywhere from 25 to 30, definitely 25, and really closer to 30 points of alignment that Daniel foretold that align with what actually happened as recorded in the book of 1st Maccabees. It's also recorded in other history books. The second reason we're touching on these events is because it was the Maccabean revolt in the 2nd century BCE, which led to the establishment of the festival of Hanukkah, a celebration that Yeshua, took part in, as documented in John chapter 10, verse 22. So chronologically and prophetically, these events are quite important. The alignment between Daniel chapter 11 and what actually happened in the time of the Maccabees is so strong that there is a segment of biblical historians who question the date that the book of Daniel was written. And they say, oh no, it was written hundreds of years later. How else could his prophecy have aligned so closely? But no, this was the hand of Father Yahweh. All right, so we're just going to touch on these briefly because I have about 3 minutes here. If you go and read the apocryphal book of 1st Maccabees, it's an amazing history lesson. I am not teaching it as biblical canon. We're looking at it as a history lesson. This book was not seemingly written with the idea of providing theological instruction, but the crux of the story is this. When the book of Malachi closes, the Persians are still ruling in the promised land. The next empire to take power in that part of the world was the Greek Empire. After the 323 BCE death of Alexander the Great, that amazing young general who led the Greeks to topple the Persian Empire, the future of the Greek kingdom was in peril. Why? Because Alexander left no heir. He died at age 32, mysteriously. And when he died, his conquered territory was then divided up among 4 of his most accomplished and powerful generals. The land of Judea was assigned to a man of Seleucid heritage named Antiochus IV, nicknamed his own nickname for himself, Epiphanes. In 175 BCE, this very evil dude came to power, and Daniel foresaw him. Daniel speaks of things that Antiochus IV later did, hundreds of years later. The Greeks set out on a campaign to get the Jews in their territory to abandon the worship of Father Yahweh and to bow down instead before the Greeks' pagan idols. And sadly, many of the Jews did become Hellenized, which means that they largely abandoned the Torah halakha, the Torah walk, to adopt Greek customs, Greek ways of living, etc. And they did this in order to curry economic and political favor. The Matthias Hashman family refused to do this and instead began to lead a revolt against the Greeks in 167 BCE. And over a period of 40 years, Father Yahweh showed tremendous favor to these courageous Jewish rebels, eventually allowing them to retake the temple, to cleanse it, and to reestablish the rightful Levitical priesthood. The surname Hashman morphed into Hasmonean in the Greek parlance, but a nickname for this family was the Maccabees. The Maccabees. And the last of the 5 sons of Matthias was Simon, whose son was John Hyrcanus. And the book of First Maccabees ends with his exploits. However, the later Maccabean sons saw the Romans as more benevolent and sought to make a political alliance with them for peace in the region. The Hasmonean dynasty lasted until 63 BCE. One of the more famous Hasmoneans, and one mentioned in the New Covenant scriptures, was Herod the Great. Although he was born an Edomite, he was a descendant of Esau. He married a Hasmonean princess as a political alliance, and he did that to make himself appear more legitimate in the eyes of the Jews. This political deal-making, however, and pandering was a serious miscalculation as the Roman Empire grew in power. And by the time of Yeshua, the Romans had shown themselves to be 10 times the tyrants that the Greeks ever had been. So in our next session, we will start in the year 7 BCE and begin to study the chronology of the New Covenant scriptures, the New Testament. We'll discover much from the Tanakh there, as 2/3 of the Newer Testament is taken from the Old. But I am way out of time. So I will say shalom, shalom, and see you next Wednesday. If you missed today's show or want to watch it again, or want to tell someone where they can watch this episode, go to lambnetwork.tv, where you will find the show and all the other live Lamb Show archives in the on-demand section of the website. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to tell someone about the Messianic Lamb Network. We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussions, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the lambnetwork.tv website. I'm Gena Hood, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.